The Israeli soldiers who opened fire on pro-Palestinian protesters in Syria as they marched on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights is what, of course, you're talking about. Unconfirmed reports on Syrian state television. Now, you've got to take what Syrian state TV says with a pinch of salt, but they say 20 people have been killed and more than 300 wounded. We'll talk, Charlie and Stephen, to you both about this in just a second. First of all, let me let you hear from Mark Regev. I spoke to him earlier on. He's the spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister, and I asked him why Israeli security forces had opened fire on unarmed protesters.
I mean, ultimately, we had a situation where you had this mob approaching the border, throwing rocks, throwing Molotov cocktails, throwing other projectiles, trying to force their way into my country. We couldn't allow it to happen. I'd remind you also, if I could, that there is an official legal state of war between Israel and Syria. And the whole idea that a group of enemy nationals just forces themselves into your country, breaking down the border fence and trying to get in to your territories, of course, no country would stand for that.
How were they trying to force their way into your country?
By tearing down the border fence and by, despite continuous warnings not to proceed, they continued to do so. I mean, at first we passed a message through the United Nations observers. When that failed, we used loudspeakers in Arabic urging them not to come into the border. When that failed, we shot into the air. So actually live fire was only used as a very, very last resort.
And these unarmed protesters managed to scare your forces?
Well, when you use the word unarmed, you're correct if they weren't carrying rifles or bazookas, but they were throwing rocks, throwing Molotov cocktails and other projectiles, and they were determined by using force to tear down the border fence.
So if someone throws a rock, you shoot at them with a machine gun?
No, if someone is trying deliberately to enter your territory illegally, despite being continuously warned not to do so, you have the right under international law to protect your territory. That holds for any member of the United Nations, and it holds true for Israel too. But I think anyone who looks at the photographs, you see these groups of highly organized, violent men trying to push their way through the border. Now, just 2.5 weeks ago, we had a situation where scores of these people entered our territory. It was a real security problem. We couldn't allow it to happen again.
How many people have been killed, Mark?
No one knows. I know that the Syrian state television is broadcasting all sorts of numbers, but I think everyone at the BBC too, everyone knows that the data given by Syrian state television isn't normally always accurate. They are very loose with the truth.
So your troops were firing so indiscriminately that they don't know how many people they killed?
On the contrary, sir. On the contrary. We were firing selectively and only as a last resort. Now, we think the numbers coming out of Syria are exaggerated, and it's not by accident. You know, the Syrians were covering this whole border situation live. They don't usually cover demonstrations, as you know. In fact, they do their best not to cover demonstrations.
Well, that's Mark Regev, spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister. Charlie and Stephen, we will get your reaction in just a second, because the journalist and specialist of Middle East affairs, Nabila Ramdani, is actually joining us now. What do you think of the Israeli action today?
Well, I'm absolutely shocked by, at Mark Regev's words. Anybody looking at, the footage of what happened today can see very clearly the brutality of the Israeli army and the use of extreme force. And what the Israelis are saying bears no relation whatsoever with what's happened today. And there's a complete mismatch between the footage the world could see of what happened and the slick propaganda of Mark Regev. What this footage shows is the Israeli army using live fire, tear gas, and also skunk, which is an obnoxious liquid that smells of body waste. So if it's not good enough to kill people, you have to humiliate them by covering them with this disgusting liquid. And I find it extremely sick, in fact, that the Israeli government is trying to, whitewash the murder of unarmed civilians who have, legitimate anger.
Aren't the Israelis entitled to protect their own territory?
What the methods used by the Israeli army are not legitimate crowd control measures.
So how would you have protected the territory if you were an Israeli?
Well, if you're, dealing with the young people we've seen on footage, which are, young people wearing T-shirts, some of them barefoot, clearly unarmed. They might have been throwing rocks, shouting slogans, and indeed threatening barbed wire fences, but to describe them as a threat to people, to a border, or indeed to property is absolutely obscene, and there are much more effective crowd control measures which do not involve killing people.
Like what, Nabila?
But, it's absolutely... I'm not an army person, but there are very clear techniques to control people in crowds, angry crowds, as we see, in demonstrations. There are very, definite measures to deal with angry protesters, especially when they're unarmed. But the most telling footage I've seen today shows a group of about 6 Israeli infantrymen using their high-velocity rifles to pick off targets in the valley below, and they all look entirely relaxed, with one punching the air and smiling, presumably in happiness at having hit an unarmed protester. And so it was purely and simply a turkey shoot.
Charlie?
I have to disagree. I think if you want to talk about whitewash, let's look at what happens in Syria every day. We do know, at least I know from the last celebration, as they call it, the Nakba, a couple of weeks ago that Mark Regev spoke about, that had been promoted for weeks earlier by the Syrians on state radio and especially on Facebook. This is a propaganda move trying to force the Israelis into a position where they defend themselves, and the Syrians are probably hoping that some of their citizens got killed for the propaganda value. Meanwhile, you see stories that don't get reported. Nabila doesn't talk about the
Charlie,
the
you cannot say that with any credibility, that the Syrians were hoping that their own population would be killed.
Of course they do. If you look, this is a country. Wait a minute. This is a country.
Utterly false logic, Charlie.
Nabila,
I have been highly critical of the Syrian regime.
Yeah, but hold on.
And the appalling tactics used by the Syrian regime to crack down on their own people.
So wait a minute. Let me make my point here. As you're saying, the Syrians have no problems in cracking down and killing their own people in the hundreds, and you think they wouldn't worry for a this is the same regime.
So
I have a story. Please let me finish.
That the whole world have been seeing today is made up by the Syrian regime as a distraction.
Let me answer it. You had your turn. Let me answer your points, okay? This is the same Syrian regime that doesn't get reported. I have a story here in front of me. Torture of child martyr, Rebel 13, shot, kneecapped, and had genitals removed before being killed by Syrian sadistic regime. So I don't think they care about their people. Now, I happen to know...
are you saying that a civilized state like Israel should equate its method with the brutal methods of a dictatorship like we have in Syria?
I don't think they should at all. And I do know that the Israeli IDF has been termed by
so are
Richard...
You saying,
would you stop interrupting? Nabila,
hold on.
Nabila,
okay.
and let me finish the sentence, please.
1 second. Charlie, you can finish the sentence. Nabila, I will let you respond. Go on, Charlie.
Thank you. Colonel Richard Kemp of this country calls the IDF the most moral force in the world. You have to put it in the context of a country, as Mark Regev said, who is in a state of war with the Syrians and have every right to protect their border. And I know the Israeli army is the moral force that Colonel Richard Kemp called them. Nabila is talking about seeing footage, but she's making assumptions. You don't know what the snipers were shooting at. They were probably, as Regev said, they were shooting over the heads. They have a right to protect themselves. So there's a lot of assumptions.
So what, Charlie, do you think of people who get shot for throwing stones?
It's more than just throwing stones. It's very easy, Stephen, and I understand. I'm answering. It's very easy to think of them as harmless people, but you have people that are doing a couple things. One, they're endangering the lives of soldiers by throwing these stones. They are attacking a border and also setting a precedent. And Israel, as with any country, has a right to protect itself.
How does it endanger the life of a soldier throwing a stone?
Have you ever been hit by a rock? Have you ever been hit by a rock?
I've been hit by a petrol bomb. I've been out doing that type of training, Charlie. So yes, I have. I've been in armed gear, and yes, I've been hit. And there are many crowd control techniques that go well beyond.
And the Israelis used those, and they still didn't respond.
Using live ammunition towards someone that's throwing a rock at them?
Live ammunition over their heads. I've had live ammunition in training over my head.
But Charlie, you defend the right, do you, of a soldier to shoot with a live ammunition a human being holding a rock?
Yes, in a state of war, in a state, Nabila, we don't need the high dudgeon. In a state of war where one is having their border attacked, which is what was going on today, and a soldier has a right to protect himself.
By unarmed men wearing T-shirts and no shoes.
Nabila, you can respond. You can respond, Nabila.
I am utterly shocked and appalled by Charlie's comments that justifying that the Israeli army can legitimately use live fire, tear gas, and all sorts of tactics to
they use tear gas in this country.
Put down what is essentially an unarmed protest and a legitimate protest at a border. So, in effect, Charlie is saying that the Israeli army is perfectly right to use live ammunition to kill unarmed demonstrators. That is absolutely shocking. And let me tell you something, Charlie, and you know that. I have been highly critical of the Syrian regime and the appalling tactics that it's using against its own people. But to come, with your utter false logic to say, since the Syrian regime is killing its own people, then it's perfectly legitimate for Israel
that is not what
to kill
I have said. No, Nabila, you've twisted.
Shocking.
You've twisted my words. You have twisted my words. What
Absolutely
I have said.
Not.
No, you have twisted my words. That is not what I said.
No, you said that the Syrian regime doesn't care for the lives of
the Syrians do not
people,
care. No,
and hence the Israeli army.
No, that is not what I said. You're putting words in my mouth. I'm sorry, Nabila. I said the Syrians do not care about their people. So, in other words, if the Israelis should kill some of their people and they get a propaganda coup out of it, it does not bother the Syrians. The
it's
Israelis.
Not about the Syrian propaganda coup.
Let me finish the sentence, please.
Let
me finish the
outrage.
sentence.
It's about a world outcry at what the Israeli regime is doing.
Not. No, it is not. It's this
to
whole
unarmed people.
No,
and
it is not.
Reiterate
it is.
this. So you're saying that if a crowd goes out unarmed, it's perfectly legitimate for the Israeli army to use live fire. And
what I said is the Israelis have a right to protect their border.
But to protect what?
Would you please let me finish the sentence and please take a breath, okay? Calm down.
Are you
take
telling
a breath
me
and calm down.
that
Let me
unarmed
finish.
people...
1 second.
No,
one second.
You're drawing
wait
a lot
one
of...
second.
Wait
1 second. Both of you wait 1 second. We've got to control this tonight. Bishop Stephen Lowe.
I watched the live footage, or I think it was live footage on BBC News earlier on this evening. The Israeli soldiers were up one side of the valley. They were a good 200 to 300 metres with two fences in between them and the protesting Syrians. The notion that those Syrians were about to invade Israel was as about remote a possibility as you could imagine, because they did not have wire cutters, they did not have the sort of things that could tear down two very large fences over a piece of land as well in between, which was a no man's land, if you like, in between the two fences. What I saw was a large group, yes, of very angry Syrians protesting, no doubt for reasons they felt very passionate about, on an anniversary in relation to the invasion of the Golan Heights, which by international law at the moment anyway is an area disputed between Syria and Israel. And it seems to me perfectly proper that Syrians should be allowed to protest about that particular invasion. What I saw was, first of all, tear gas being shot at the protesters, who I say were a good 200 to 300 metres away, and then live ammunition being shot at them as well, because they didn't back off with the tear gas. Now, I find that, Charlie, whether we like it or not, indefensible, because we have spent, and I've heard you say these things as well, about regimes which have actually used live ammunition on protesters who are rising up against authorities which they are unhappy with across the whole of the Middle East. You have condemned that when it has happened, and I find it very sad that you are not prepared to condemn the Israeli army for using live ammunition against protesters under these circumstances.
I'll tell you why, because A, we don't know if they were protesters. If they wanted to protest, I have no problem with protesting. I still, again...
Have you not seen the footage,
Nabila,
Charlie?
Please, can I get one sentence? Nabila, I have seen the footage. Could I please at least...
So can you stick to facts instead of speculating?
Let's
let Charlie finish, and then Nabila, you can have your
notice
response.
how the bishop and I interrelate. I gave him as much time as he needed, uninterrupted, and now it's my turn, so please let me speak uninterrupted, okay? Bishop, I agree with you. I think as far as protest is concerned, I have no problem with that. But again, you're talking about governments firing on their own people, Tiananmen Square, Saudi Arabia, etc. We've talked about, and I agree wholeheartedly. But this is a situation where you have troops that are defending a border, and they do have a right. And as you said, they went with tear gas first, and I don't see how that's cruel and inhuman. We use it in this country and other places. Tear gas is regularly used. The crowd did not disperse. They were told in Arabic. There was live fire shot over their heads, and again, I've had live fire shot over my head in training exercises. They still did not respond. So at some point, a decision has to be made, and again, I have to leave that to these commanders. And I do know, again, I'll quote Colonel Richard Kemp. I've met the man. He calls it the most moral army in the world. And I know people who've been in the IDF. They're not going to shoot on unarmed civilians for no reason whatsoever.
And there is speculation, Nabila, I'll let you come in 1 second. There is speculation, Charlie, that a 12-year-old child has been shot dead. Could that ever be justified?
No, but I don't think any Israeli would purposely shoot at a 12-year-old, and I would have to ask, why would any parent put a 12-year-old in that position? It's like me taking my 6-year-old down to the G20 protests or the cut protests, knowing it was going to go kick off and there's going to be riot police down there. I wouldn't take my child into that situation.
Nabila.
Nobody can condone this level of force against unarmed civilians. This is a hugely important story, and I'm kind of disappointed it's not making the front pages of our newspapers, and it echoes. I was referring to the slick propaganda put forward by Mark Regev. It has been taken up by Netanyahu, calling the demonstrators terrorists, which is absolutely obscene. This is what the Israeli army has been doing, is murder, pure and simple. And Charlie, you cannot possibly underplay the seriousness of all this, because you cannot possibly answer what is effectively a legitimate protest with live fire. It's
well, again,
abominable.
you weren't there to know if it was a legitimate protest or if these people were approaching the fence in such a way. And to me, it says something that when people...
But the very fact, Charlie, that you're denying reality is absolutely...
Well, no, here's a reality. As Regev said, and it's true, they were given several warnings from tear gas... to loudspeaker hails in Arabic saying, please, you are in a war zone, remove yourselves or you will be shot at, and they did not respond. This is an army on a border, and and they are fully within their legal... All right. You may not like it, and you may think it's immoral.
No, I do not like it at all.
Because I want Bishop Lowe to be able to have a chance tonight.
Just to finish the sentence, they're totally within their legal
Nabila,
rights.
I'm going to let you have one final right reply, and then I want to hear from Bishop Lowe.
So what Charlie is saying is basically, if he goes to a protest in London, for example, he expects to be shot at.
No,
because it's a perfectly legitimate way of dealing with demonstrators, of course. This is a well-known fact, especially coming from a civilized state.
I'm not going to, when I go to London, I'm not attacking a foreign border.
Nabila, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bishop Lowe.
I'm sad because I don't recognise Charlie or Mark Regev's description of what I saw on the television this evening, on the footage which was being shown from the Israeli side of what actually happened. I didn't see any real threat to the border. I saw a large group of people shouting, protesting and so on in exactly the same way as we've seen throughout the whole of the Middle East and over the last 3-4 months. I find the notion that the Israeli Defence Force is the most moral defence force or army in the world quite extraordinary. We have got a catalogue of incidents, to put it mildly, from Gaza into the West Bank and so on, where the Israeli forces have behaved frankly in ways which have offended international law and had no moral justification whatsoever, including the deaths of large numbers, dare one say it, of children who have been shot by Israeli defence forces over the years. I'm sorry, Charlie, but I think tonight the Israeli government, by their aggression, has shown again their lack of a desire for a Middle East peace settlement.